think so, yeah.
All right.
Is it Lashon or Lashley?
Lasher. Like eyelash.
Get it correct.
Good evening,
Good evening.
and thank you for joining us tonight in College Park at the University of Maryland. I'm Lucy Dalglish, Dean of the Philip Merrill College of Journalism. Welcome to our audience here at the Riggs Alumni Center, and welcome also to the more than 300 people who registered to watch tonight's events online. As you probably have surmised, tonight's gubernatorial candidate climate forum is being recorded. Please silence your telephones. My Merrill College colleagues and I are delighted to co-sponsor tonight's gubernatorial candidate climate forum. We have enjoyed working with our co-sponsors, which include the Maryland League of Conservation Voters Education Fund, Maryland Matters, the Environmental Justice Journalism Initiative, the NAACP Maryland State Conference, the CCAN Action Fund, the Maryland chapter of the Sierra Club, and Ed Hatcher and Angie Cannon. Now, to share with you the format and rules for tonight's forum, please welcome Kim Coble, Executive Director of the Maryland League of Conservation Voters Education Fund.
Good evening, and thank you to Lucy and to the Philip Merrill School of Journalism. It's an honor to have worked with you for a very memorable night, I'm sure. As Lucy said, I'm Kim Coble. I'm the Executive Director of the Maryland League of Conservation Voters and the Maryland LCV Education Fund. Maryland LCV uses political action and education to fight for clean water, healthy air, and resilient community for all Marylanders. I want to welcome and thank the candidates for being here and participating tonight, and for some of them for tomorrow night as well. And I also want to thank you in the audience that are here in person and also virtually. Between tonight and tomorrow night, we have over 1,000 people signed up to hear what the candidates are saying. Maryland LCV is honored to be co-hosting this forum as well as tomorrow night's forum at Goucher College with Maryland Matters. Maryland Matters has been a much-needed addition to the Maryland journalism landscape and shares our commitment to ensuring Maryland voters understand the threat of climate change. Before I introduce the panelists, I also want to send a very sincere thank you to Chuck Bakari, Maryland LCV Education Fund Board Chair, and the Maryland LCV staff for their dedication and work to ensure we have an educational and informative forum. I'm proud to introduce our three excellent panelists for this evening. Josh Kurtz is the founding editor of Maryland Matters. Dr. Tanya Harrison Edwards, Legislative Affairs Chair for the NAACP Prince George's County Branch, and Rona Cabal, President of the Board and co-founder of the Environmental Justice Journalism Initiative. The framework, thank you. The framework for this evening is as follows. Our panelists have crafted several questions over an array of environmental topics and have randomly selected 3 candidates to answer each question. The panelists will rotate through the sets of questions, with each candidate being given 1 minute to answer. Candidates will also be asked to make a 2.5-minute opening statement and a 2-minute closing statements. So again, many thanks for joining us for this forum. Reminder, please silence your phones, and we ask that the audience that's here in person for no signs or cheering. This is an event that's meant to be educational, and it's a forum, not a debate. I know we have a lot to do and a lot of great information coming, so I'll turn the microphone over to Josh Kurtz.
Thank you, Kim, and thanks everyone for being here. Thanks to all the candidates, thanks to the audience, and thanks to the folks watching at home, as they say. So we're very excited to have 10 candidates here, and we'll introduce them to speak and ask them to speak in a minute. Let me tell you first about who's not here, because we've invited all the candidates for governor. Two of the Republican candidates, former State Commerce Secretary Kelly Schultz and State Delegate Dan Cox, both declined our invitations. Former Prince George's County Executive Rushern Baker initially said he would be with us, but has since bowed out. And State Comptroller Peter Francho is not here tonight, but we are doing another one of these tomorrow night at Goucher College in Baltimore. Comptroller Francho will be there. And tomorrow's will be live streamed too. They'll be available on various environmental groups and the NAACP's Facebook pages. So I think between the two forums, we'll have a great record of candidate statements on climate. As Kim mentioned, we're going to start by offering each of the candidates a 2.5-minute opening statement. We're going to actually embed a question into that opening statement. And so we'll get to those opening statements in a minute, but first let me introduce the candidates who are here, starting from my left. We have college lecturer and founder of the Bread and Roses Party, Jerome Siegel. We have former Obama administration official, Ashwani Jain. We have former U.S. and Maryland Labor Secretary, Tom Perez. We have former Clinton administration official, John Barron. We have former U.S. Education Secretary, John King. Former State Attorney General, Doug Gansler. I should mention these are all Democrats. We have the Libertarian nominee and a former state official, IT official, healthcare official, business entrepreneur, David Lasher. We have military veteran, best-selling author, former nonprofit CEO, Wes Moore. We have former state delegate and attorney, Robin Ficker, and our lone Republican here tonight. And we have former Anne Arundel County Executive, Laura Newman. So let's give the candidates a quick round of applause. So we're going to begin with opening statements in that order, but as I said, there's going to be a question embedded in that statement. And the question we want you to answer while you're introducing yourself is, what's your top climate priority for the state of Maryland? And I guess I'm playing timekeeper too, so watch the space. Mr. Siegel.
Is this on?
I believe so.
Is this working? Yeah. So I've been asked to talk about really two things, myself and climate. I'm going to actually put a pin in the climate thing for later because we have a whole evening on it. I'll just say 3 words and then I'll come back to it. The Wuling Mini. The Wuling Mini is the second best-selling EV in the world. Now, I'm running as a Bread and Roses socialist. What is that? It's 3/4 Bernie Sanders, 3/5 Bernie Sanders, 1/5 Henry David Thoreau, and 1/5 18th century Quakers. So who's Jerome Siegel? In the paper, they say, activist socialist. Well, for 2 words, I'll take it. But I think I'm actually more than an activist socialist. I'm the author of 7 books. The most relevant to this discussion tonight is called Graceful Simplicity, The Philosophy and Politics of the Alternative American Dream. I have a doctorate in philosophy, and I taught full-time at the University of Pennsylvania for a number of years, and in particular, I taught philosophy of education when I was there, which will be relevant to a critique that I want to level on the blueprint, which a lot of people got a free ride. After I left Penn. Actually, I left Penn deliberately because I wanted to go into public affairs. I went back to school, got a master's degree in public affairs, a second master, and my first role in government actually was at the UN, assisting Clarence Mitchell in his confrontation with Foreign Minister Forster, in his confrontation with Forster of South Africa over apartheid. I then spent 2 years, or actually 3.5 years on the Hill, but 2 of them were on the staff of the House Budget Committee, where I was administrator of a task force on social justice. Then I spent 10 years in the United States Agency for International Development. Okay, my goodness, all right. All right, let me just jump to, I spent most of my time in the last 4 decades on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You may think that it's got very little to do with being governor. Hogan came out against Ukraine the other day and broke a state-to-state agreement with the region of Leningrad. The first week that I'm going to rip up Hogan's executive order on BDS, and I'm going to recognize the state of Palestine, and we're going to open up a negotiation of a partnership state-to-state agreement between Maryland and the state of Palestine.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Jain.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Ashwani Jain. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm running for governor to make our politics more inclusive and accessible. Now, this idea of inclusion started when I was 13 and diagnosed with a type of cancer. During that time, I didn't think I would get to leave the 4 walls of that hospital room. I also found many who were making decisions for me instead of with me. And so I felt really depressed, hopeless, and helpless. And I also thought if I was blessed enough to get a second chance at life, I would make it count. And luckily, I not only beat cancer, but I turned from survivor to advocate. And it's that level of advocacy that I'm bringing to the governor's office and to this race. And yes, I would be the nation's youngest governor, but I have both the experience and perspective needed to serve each of you well. I have worked in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. I helped manage the political appointee process in the Obama White House, worked on affordable health care at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, worked on affordable housing at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and I helped get the NIH and the FDA billions in additional revenue when I was then Vice President Biden's Director of Outreach for the Cancer Moonshot. Equally important, I'm a product of Maryland Public Schools. I'm a proud alumni of this university. I'm a proud Terp. I'm a son of immigrants and minority-owned small business owners. And I'm a cancer survivor who knows what it feels like to be written off or have others make decisions for me instead of with me. That's why we created the very first statewide campaign in the United States where 100% of our events are free and accessible. 100% of our policies, including our climate policies, were written by climate activists and residents, not consultants. And 100% of our campaign operation is run by volunteers and residents from every age, background, and county in this state. And so to answer your second point, my climate priority really is to look at the issue in a very comprehensive way and engage climate activists and those impacted by these policies from day one of my operation, not just after the election, and before and during the budget process, not just after it.
Thank you. Secretary Perez.
Time is running out to tackle the challenge of climate change. Maryland is falling behind. Those are not my words. Those are the conclusions in a December 2021 report commissioned by the Able Foundation. I'm running for governor because time is of the essence, not only on climate change, but on educational opportunity, jobs, justice, and opportunity. And I'm running for governor so that everyone will have access to jobs, justice, and opportunity. One thing I've learned from my service in local government, state government, and the federal government is that so many challenges we have are intersectional. In other words, it's not just one agency that has skin in the game. Climate change is one such example. And the challenge we have at the state is that we have all too frequently dealt with the challenges of climate change, one agency at a time. And so if I have the privilege of being your governor, the first thing I will do is appoint a climate and resiliency director, that person who will understand that combating climate change is a whole of government enterprise. We will make sure we build a data dashboard so that everybody can see what we're doing, what our progress is, and how much more we need to do. When I think of climate change, I think of jobs. You ask me, Josh, what are our priorities? Jobs and justice. We are going to become an offshore wind capital of the United States, a solar capital of the United States. We are going to construct an institute for energy innovation because someday it might be fusion energy, someday it might be geothermal. We want to always be ahead of the curve. We need to make sure that our transportation infrastructure reflects our climate change imperatives, which is why we need to build the red line. We need to finish the purple line. We need access to rail down to Charles County. Folks, we must always look at all of this through the lens of equity and inclusion. My entire career has been about equity and inclusion, civil rights, labor rights, jobs, justice. As we tackle these challenges intersectionally, it is really important to have a governor who has that demonstrated track record of making things work, getting stuff done. And that is what I intend to do if I have the privilege of being your governor.
Thank you. Mr. Barron.
Thank you. I'm John Barron, former nonprofit executive. Before that, I headed roughly $1 billion technology program in the Clinton administration. I've been an appointee of Democratic and Republican presidents, twice confirmed by the Senate. I've gotten major federal legislation enacted into law that's benefited Maryland and many other states. The reason I'm running for governor is that Maryland is not making progress on major problems that damage the lives of millions of people, and I'm offering a fundamentally different approach. In education, for instance, more than a quarter of middle school students in our state cannot read at a basic level. More than a third can't do basic math. Those numbers are no different than they were 20 years ago. More than 500,000 Marylanders live below the poverty line, and we've made zero progress reducing the state's poverty rate in more than 30 years. Low and moderate income Marylanders have seen stagnant wages since the 1980s as income inequality has soared. Our state can't just keep doing the same thing we've been doing for decades, rolling out one unproven government program after the next and expect a different result because many programs, no matter how well-intentioned they are, just don't work. So to make progress, we have to expand programs that don't just sound like they're good ideas, but have been tested in the real world and shown to make a big difference in people's lives. That's been the mission of my career and of the bipartisan reforms that I've gotten enacted into law. Now it's time to bring this evidence-based approach that I've spearheaded to Maryland. So, Josh, when I'm the governor of Maryland, we're going to do what's proven to work. I'll give you one quick example. We're going to expand high-quality tutoring to every struggling first and second grader in the entire state of Maryland, because that has been shown to move them up toward grade level early before their problems become serious in later grades. And we're going to do this by engaging the community, including retirees and recent college graduates, to become tutors for a modest stipend as a public service. That's just one example of a proven program. But the key theme is, if we simply continue on our current course, we're going to be here in another 20 years. Nothing will have changed. To make progress, we have to zero in on solutions that are tested and proven. Now, in climate policy, my approach is similar. Let's do what works. Maryland has actually made great progress over the past 15 years. We've reduced climate emissions 38% since 2005. Tonight, I'm going to outline an ambitious regional initiative working with other states to build on that progress and lead the nation on climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. Secretary King.
Thanks so much. First, let me thank LCV and Sierra Club and CCAN and NAACP and the entire environmental community for the opportunity to be in tonight's conversation. My name is John King. I was a teacher and principal. I was United States Secretary of Education for President Obama, but more than that, I'm a public school parent with kids whose future I worry about because of the climate emergency and the impact it will have on them and on their kids. We are already seeing the consequences of climate change around the state. We are seeing flooding regularly in many parts of the state, including Ellicott City. We are losing farmland on the eastern shore to saltwater intrusion. We have some of the worst asthma in the country in Baltimore. These are not 50 years from now problems. They are today problems that demand specific, actionable plans. And unfortunately, I think tonight what you're going to hear from many of my colleagues is platitudes, is promises without details, without specifics, without targets, without hard choices. But the reality is we can't make the progress we need to on climate or protecting our environment or addressing environmental justice or making our communities more resilient if we aren't willing to be specific. Now, I come to this issue not only with a passion, but with real experience. I co-chair a national commission on mobilizing the K-12 sector to take on climate action. It's comprised of civil rights organizations, environmental groups, education leaders, and youth activists. And I also founded a progressive advocacy organization called Strong Future Maryland that's worked with many in this room to advance real action on climate in the Maryland General Assembly. So for me, the top goal is get to net zero by 2035. That should be our shared goal. That will require ambitious action. It will require us to commit to getting to 100% net zero public buildings, state office buildings, schools, higher ed campuses. It will require us to commit to making sure that all of our energy production is clean by 2030. It will require us to reduce get to 60% of our vehicles being electric vehicles, including trucks, by 2030, and moving our entire state fleet, all of our school buses and public transit, to electric by 2030. But that is all achievable if we have leadership that is committed to specific action, and that's what I'll do as governor.
Thank you. Attorney General Gansler.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you to the University of Maryland, which my father was a longtime teacher here and a dean, and thank you to the environmental community for being here. When we talk about climate change, I think there's two very important things we need to recognize. One is we need to have somebody with credibility in the field, and while all of my colleagues here are wonderful, nice people and have had successes in their fields, the environment has been my issue, along with crime, and keeping people safe in a just way and making the state stronger. I served 23 years in government. I was a federal prosecutor. I was a state's attorney in Montgomery County. As state's attorney in Montgomery County, I started the first environmental crimes unit in our state's history, going after people on the criminal level, not just the civil level. When I was attorney general, the reason why I ran for attorney general was because of the environment. I became known by my colleagues around the country as the environmental attorney general. In fact, I ran the National Association of Attorneys General Environmental Committee. We did things like get roxarsone taken out of chicken feed, which is basically arsenic, and putting it into the water. We went after Reggie. We did CAFO legislation. We did things that, that my colleagues up here don't know what they are. I'm probably the only person here who's been to MDE. I'm certainly the only person here who's been to the Conowingo Dam. We've done an enormous amount as Attorney General going after corporate polluters. We did 22 river audits, and we took on and made the state cleaner and safer. As governor, and I should mention we had a special assistant for the environment, and many of you were nice enough to serve on my environmental council, which I started and General Frosch continued. As governor, I'm going to have a climate czar. We're going to have somebody just like I did when I was attorney general reporting directly to me, going to be reporting directly to me as governor. You know I'm going to do that because I've done it before. And we're able to do this going forward. We're going to have offshore wind in Ocean City. We're going to have solar farms throughout the state, both on state property, residential, and commercial. We're going to have that chicken manure power plant that I've been working on for years in the Eastern Shore to convert the 2 billion pounds of chicken manure into a source of clean power. We're going to get the infrastructure in our state for electric vehicles. And so we need to make sure that not only do we have somebody who's a true environmentalist as governor, but with all due respect to the one Republican here, we need somebody that can actually win the general election in this, the most Republican year of our lifetime. None of this will matter. None of the platitudes that you're going to hear from my colleagues matters unless we win.
Thank you. Mr. Lasher.
I am David Lasher, your Libertarian candidate for governor. And for those in Maryland who are happy with what they've been seeing and getting from the Democrats and the Republicans for the last 10 years and more, you've got many good choices up here on the stage. But for those who have been less happy with what they've been seeing and getting, I am standing as a principled, accomplished, and civil alternative. I am an IT executive with experience in federal and state government, and I live in Annapolis with my wife and daughter, My wife has spent her entire career in environmental protection and natural resources. On the climate, I am concerned but not panicked, because that's what my read of the science, including AR6, says is appropriate. We need to decarbonize using market-based approaches to promote clean energy. And for the clean energy portfolio, we need to diversify. We need to diversify beyond wind and solar to include options like nuclear, sustaining that which we already have, and promoting modern, modular nuclear, which has great potential for the state, the country, and the world. I have a personal passion for the blueprint for the Bay, including action against Pennsylvania to make sure that the cost of fertilizer runoff into the Susquehanna is not borne by the Bay and Marylanders and Virginians. Those costs need to be borne at the source in Pennsylvania. I want to close my introductory comments here with a few words on science. First, science is a mindset and a method. It's a mindset of humility and skepticism. It's a method of debate and dissent, all of which has been too much in absence in recent years. And two, if we learn nothing else from the pandemic, I would hope that what we learned is no more should we mix politics and science. Science, when politicized, is corrupted. Real science is humble, it is debated, and it is neutral. So that's me, David Lasher. I am concerned but not panicked. I am devoted to clean energy for a better climate, a stronger economy, and affordable energy for all in Maryland.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Mr. Lasher. Mr. Moore.
Thank you so much, and good evening, everybody. It is great to be here at College Park at my wife's alma mater, and thank you for this conversation. There are going to be three issues that are going to be the most important issues that our state has got to wrestle with over the next decade. How the state can be more competitive and also more equitable, how we can close the racial wealth gap, and how we can address climate. And the thing about each and every one of those issues, there's not a single one of them that is a new issue, but each and every one of them are a now issue. Because we are already seeing the impacts of climate on our society. When we know that as a state we have lost over $10 billion because of a lack of action on climate change. When we know that as a state we still have schools that are being closed because of extreme heat or extreme storms because of a lack of resilient infrastructure. That we know we have children who are suffering from asthma at twice the rate in one part of a state as another part of a state, that we're watching 100-year storms that are taking place every 5 years. We must address this crisis climate in the way that it is showing itself, which is in every way and across every sector. And so the next governor is going to have a distinct responsibility to be able to work across sectors to be able to address this issue. The private sector, the public sector, philanthropy, community organizations, and working with the people. Because everybody's going to have a role to play in addressing this crisis, because this crisis is impacting everybody. And I have a 2-decade record of public service and leadership, of working and leading across sectors to address these issues. And so specifically the things that we need to get done, we need to make sure that in the next administration, we are going to have 100% clean energy by 2035. We are going to have net zero emissions by 2045. That we have to have a coordinating body and coordinating effort to make sure that we are working across sectors to be able to address these issues in a collective process. That this crisis is going to need a leader who has been battle-tested in these issues, battle-tested across sectors, to be able to leverage not just federal dollars, but also private dollars, to be able to work efficiently and effectively to be able to address these issues. And so so in my time of being battle-tested, including being CEO of one of the largest anti-poverty organizations in this country, having addressed these issues, myself and my running mate, former delegate Aruna Miller, we are going to make sure that we are going to lead in this time and do what I learned in the military, which is, if you want different, do different.
Thank you. Mr. Ficker.
Welcome. I'm Robin Ficker, running for governor, and I'm the only one running who wants to cut your taxes. I'm going to cut the state sales tax 2 cents, saving the average household $780 a year, making Maryland the first state ever to cut its state sales tax, and we'll get a reputation of being business friendly. My running mate, Leroy Yegi, is from Dundalk. I believe the Baltimore area is very important to have on a ticket. I've spent the last 2 summers meeting people, and I've met many of you on the boardwalk in Ocean City. Long hours there, getting your opinions. In 2 hours, I could meet people from all 23 counties, plus Baltimore City. And I'm going to take your views down to Annapolis and represent you. I believe we should make use of Calvert Cliffs nuclear plant. Right now, we have 2 reactors, each one of which has about 860 megahertz of energy, mega gigs of energy produced every year, 860 per plant. 12 years ago, we tried to double that with a 3rd reactor that was twice as big. It was turned down at the last minute. We need to reactivate that idea and get a 3rd reactor in Calvert Cliffs. Those 2 power plants in Calvert Cliffs now serve 1 million homes a year. We can make that 2 million and save a lot of energy. As for cleaning up the bay, people entrap everywhere around the bay. If you have a sewage treatment plant that doesn't work, fix it now, because when I'm governor, we're going to check on you and make sure that it's running well. We have a modern-day Stalin working over in Russia now. I've studied Stalin, and we need to help the people that he is trying to kill. And the way we do that is by undercutting his profits, the profits he's making, because Russia is little more than a gas station. They earn 50% of their revenue for gas. We need to bring the prices down.
Time's up. Thank you. Ms. Newman.
Good evening. My name is Laura Newman, and I have listened to several of the candidates talk about their long careers serving the environment, and I thank them for that. The concept of caring about the environment came to me later in life, probably later than many of my fellow candidates. You see, where I grew up, the streets were asphalt, the sidewalks were concrete, the houses were brick, and the roofs were tar. And you knew when someone was getting a new roof because you could smell the tar throughout the neighborhood. The concept of the environment didn't really exist for us in inner city Baltimore. We talk a lot about food deserts. We should be talking about nature deserts. If we want people to care about the environment, then everyone needs to have access to the environment. And the truth is, in my earlier days, I was much more focused on choosing between eating, shelter, and gas than I was on whether or not we had a Chesapeake Bay, which of course I hadn't seen yet. So I do understand now that, as we talk about it, it's really easy to say this is what you will do, but we also don't recognize that we don't all start from the same place. Over the years, I worked really hard. I was a high school dropout, and I didn't go to college. I later got a master's degree in business from Loyola University in Maryland. I serve as an entrepreneur in residence here at University of Maryland. And I actually have also served in public office. I had the incredible honor of being county executive and running an economic development agency. After a lot of different experiences in life, I started to think about things in a different way. When you're exposed to new things, you think differently. And so for me, it became a priority to have the opportunity to get on a boat. I'd never been on a boat. So I called a friend and asked if I could go sailing on the Chesapeake Bay. And I did, and I have to tell you, 2 weeks later, I moved to Annapolis. I loved it so much. It was the greatest experience I'd ever had. I really felt like I was on vacation when I was on the water. And that's why the Chesapeake Bay is my #1 priority for Maryland and the environment. I, as county executive, came to understand the wastewater runoff that's happening in the Chesapeake Bay, the septic problem that is polluting the bay, and our response to it is to be active as a family. We are involved in cleanup, and I want to tell you a couple things. One is I have a house in Crisfield on the water. We have the most beautiful and majestic waters in the United States. We need to make sure everyone gets to see them. We also decided to become an oyster family. So we now have, we cultivate oysters, and if you'd like some, we have thousands. They're for free. We'll be happy to send them over to you. We have more than we can eat.
Wow.
Thank you.
That sounds like a good offer. Thanks so much. Thanks to all of you. We're now going to begin the question and answer period. And as I mentioned, we've kind of selected questions. We've thought out these questions. We've selected the recipients randomly. We're going to ask one question of 3 of you and then move on to another question and another 3. And so we begin with Rona Cobell.
Good evening. This question is for candidates Newman, Moore, and Perez. How would you commit to working with environmental justice advocacy organizations in Maryland to help you identify and select the heads of agencies and commissions responsible for protecting our environment? Do you feel that the state should diversify the leaders on environmental commissions and in agencies? We can start with
Ms. Newman.
Absolutely, I believe in diversifying. And you know what, you don't even have to decide. If you decide you're going to look for the most qualified, talented people, you'll automatically have diversification or diversity. It happens naturally if you're looking for talent. The way I work with folks is that I try and hire the best and the brightest. And you know, it is very well known, and I'm sure it'll come up tonight, that I vetoed the stormwater fee in Anne Arundel County. I did that because it was only implemented in 10 jurisdictions in Maryland out of 24. But what I did in response is also hire the most qualified, most talented person to run that program. And I got a lot of pushback on it. I believe that we need people who care passionately about the environment, serving the environment. And so I was willing to take that. You know what? We're going to hire the best people. We're going to make sure that they're qualified, and we're going to make sure they represent the community.
Okay, Mr. Moore.
I believe in the leadership philosophy of the people who are closest to the challenge are the ones who are closest to the solutions. The challenge is they're hardly ever at the table. You know, when I became the CEO of one of the largest anti-poverty organizations in this country, when we first came on board, I noticed that there were, when we're talking about fighting poverty and looking at the impacts of communities of color, there were no people of color in the C-suite. By the time that I left as the CEO, we had over 50% people of color within the C-suite, and our C-suite was over 70% women. The people who are closest to the challenge are the ones who are closest to the solution. So one of the things that will happen during my administration, on our first day, we will appoint someone who will report directly to me, a chief of sustainability, mitigation, and responsiveness. And that person will have coordinating efforts across all sectors of our society, private sector, nonprofit, community organizations, and it will be community organizations who are on the ground doing the work, the hundreds in the state of Maryland alone that are doing the work, that will help to establish who will sit in those positions and how we'll remain accountable to treasuring the most cherished asset we have in the state.
Thank you. Secretary Perez.
The best way to figure out what someone will do in the future is to look at what they've done in the past. I invite you to look at the staff I built when I was a member of the county council 20 years ago, when I was Maryland's labor secretary, when I led the civil rights division of the Justice Department, when I led the Department of Labor under President Obama, and when I led the Democratic National Committee. We hired the best, the brightest. We reflected the diversity broadly defined of the community. That's incredibly important, and it's not enough. You need to go all the way through the organization. When I got to the Labor Department, we were second from the bottom in worker satisfaction. Thank God for DHS. And when I left, we were in the top third. Why? Because we were intentional about listening to people. The most important question you can ask as a leader is, what do you think? And that's what we did. And when we get people to understand that you're part of something bigger, that's how you succeed as an organization. And that's what we're going to need to do on climate change.
All right, thank you. Next, my fellow panelist, Dr. Harrison Edwards, has some questions.
Good evening. This question is for King, Ficker, and Gansler. So would you hire a climate czar? And if you would hire a climate czar, what would be the responsibilities of that person?
Secretary King.
Okay. Thanks. Yes, I think it's important to have someone in the administration whose role is to coordinate, much like Gina McCarthy is doing in the Biden administration now, But every agency has to see climate action as a part of their responsibility. I think it's going to be critical for the next governor to rebuild the capacity of the Department of the Environment to actually enforce environmental regulations, to take on the poultry industry, for example, that has been allowed to pollute the Chesapeake unabated by Governor Hogan. It's going to be critically important for the governor to work with the General Assembly to insist that for every bill, climate consequences are a consideration. And we should be looking, whether we're talking about transportation policy or housing policy, we should be looking at the impact on climate and on racial equity for every piece of legislation. So yes, there'll be that one person to help coordinate and to make sure that everyone is accountable throughout the administration, but climate action will be a responsibility for everyone in a King-Syria administration.
Thank you. Mr. Ficker.
I don't think you want to vote for someone because they're going to appoint a climate czar. I think you want to vote for someone who's going to act as though he is a climate czar or she is a climate czar. And that's what I would be. I would keep every Monday morning at 6 a.m. I would have an open house for every Marylander, first come, first serve. If you see something we're not doing to improve our climate, if you are being discriminated against, if you believe our state can move ahead, come and see me, first come, first serve Monday morning. I had the definitive case in Maryland on an environmental impact statements, where we sued Metro and compelled them to file proper environmental impact statements for every amendment to the mass transit general plan. So I've been there, I took the initiative, I look at things that never were and say, why not?
Thank you. General Gansler.
Thank you. And to the last question, I'm sorry that some people up here don't know who Fred Tupman is, but when he got released, it was sort of amazing, and that's the kind of thing we won't have happen in a Gansler administration, Gansler Hollingsworth. You know, ever since I was a child, and I'm older than most everybody in this room, not all of them, but I recall the commercial with the tear coming down the Native American who was canoeing down the river. And from that moment on, I became somebody who not only is going to appoint a climate czar, and obviously we didn't coordinate on this question during my opening, but somebody who lives, breathes, and feels the environment. It makes me mad when I see people pollute our environment. That's why I went after American Electric Power in a $4.6 billion settlement. That's why I went after PBG in West Virginia, who was polluting and putting mercury over Western Maryland. That's why I went after Morant, Constellation. And I did it with you. And obviously, I'm going to appoint a climate czar. I'm going to have the same environmental committee I had when I was Attorney General. And I'm going to have the nonprofits in the room telling me what you want us to be doing.
Thank you. The next question is going to go to first Mr. Lasher, then Mr. Jane, then Mr. Barron. And it's a topic that a couple of folks have mentioned already, but I guess the question is, does nuclear power need to be a part of Maryland's clean energy portfolio? And I guess if the answer is yes, how do you propose to safely store nuclear waste from the Calvert Cliffs plant? So let's start with Mr. Lasher for that.
Thank you, Josh. Yes, as I already mentioned in my opening comments, nuclear needs to be a part of our clean energy portfolio. Not just traditional nuclear, but there are emerging technologies, advanced nuclear, that offer potential. There is a company that is based in Rockville, X Energy. They offer a solution. Where are they selling this solution? Piloting this solution. Washington State, Canada, not in Maryland. We need to change that. For us to achieve net zero goals with reliable power that is affordable to all Marylanders, we can't not use nuclear. What would, at Calvert Cliffs, where they store the nuclear, Calvert Cliffs stores its own nuclear waste, as most all nuclear power plants do today.
Time's up.
And that would be the method. Thank you, Josh.
Thanks. Mr. Jane.
Yeah, I'm going to be completely candid. I'm not sure. And the reason is when I talk to the climate activists on my team who are making all of our climate policies as well, residents who would be impacted, the issue is safety. How are you going to store this? How are you going to make sure that diverse neighborhoods, low-income neighborhoods are not going to be impacted negatively? Because we've seen this time and time again, especially when you're putting together, different power plants, coal power plants, minorities, low-income folks. We're the ones who typically get impacted in the worst case, in the short term especially. So a lot of my focus has been more on looking at, ensuring that we have environmental impact studies done for any piece of legislation that could impact the environment, investing in solar power and redeveloping our brownfields, hydropower, wind power, making sure we have free public transit, which is one part of my Maryland Now plan, making sure that we are engaging residents before, during, and after these situations so that we don't have to pick up these pieces after we move forward on certain legislation.
Thank you. Mr. Barron.
Yes, my approach is technology neutral and would include nuclear energy. Here's the big picture. One of the reasons Maryland has done so well, led the nation in reducing carbon emissions, is because since 2009, we've been part of a regional initiative with 11 other states called RGGI, where the government sets a cap, a limit on emissions from power plants and lets industry, through what's called emissions trading, buying emissions permits, determine how to achieve those caps in the most cost-effective manner. The RGGI states together have reduced carbon emissions from power plants by 47% since 2009. It's technology neutral. Industry decides, do we use solar versus wind versus nuclear versus other. I would bring that same neutral approach, which has been so successful, to work with other states on a regional basis, to have to apply the same approach to other sectors of the economy, including transportation and buildings. Now currently it just applies to power plants.
Thank you. Next question from Rona.
Yes, this question is for Mr. Siegel, Mr. Perez, and Ms. Newman. It is a two-part question, so please answer both parts. Agriculture is widely accepted to be the biggest contributor to Chesapeake Bay pollution. How do you plan to reduce farm runoff? And have you accepted or do you plan to accept any campaign contributions from the poultry industry?
Mr. Siegel.
Look, nothing I'm going to say tonight is going to make any sense unless I get more time, to tell you the truth. But think about the Green New Deal. What does single payer have to do with climate? The Green New Deal really is about the unfulfilled promises of the New Deal. And it's a perspective on crises. And it says, don't let a good crisis go to waste. It says a lot's going to be happening in response to climate change. And the big question for America is how it's done. And let's have it be done in a way that we accomplish things in terms of the fundamental issues of injustice in America. Now, essentially what that is, Bernie defines socialism as the New Deal. And what Bernie was saying basically is that we're going to do climate change in a way that brings a socialist vision to America. Well, Brendan Roses is going to do the same kind of thing, except our version of socialism is richer and more interesting than his.
Thank you.
Okay.
Time's up.
I'll try to explain a little bit further.
Let me answer your second question first. No. Let me answer your first question. The studies that I've read recently show that about 50% of the pollution going into the Chesapeake is from agriculture. And that's why we need sustainable agricultural practices. It's not getting rid of farmers. That's not how we do that. But what's really heartening to me is that there's an increasing realization of the need for sustainable agricultural practices. I think ecotourism can be a remarkable staple of the Eastern Shore economy. Cover crops have been in use for a number of years, and that has been another tool to address the pollution. But I think we need to fundamentally, continue the road ahead to sustainable agricultural practices, organic farming, things of that nature. And by the way, they're pretty darn profitable as well. So we can do well and do good by our environment and by our ag community.
Thank you. Ms. Newman.
You know, I shared earlier that I grew up in Baltimore City, and agriculture wasn't something that hit my radar screen. We bought fresh vegetables off of what was called an A-Rabber, which was a horse-drawn carriage that occasionally showed up in our back alleys selling fruits and vegetables. So when I was running economic development in Howard County, I was introduced to agriculture, and in fact, it was part of my responsibility there. And what I found is that a lot of farmers or small business people, they're working really hard. We're focused on the big guys like Purdue, but the truth is a lot of them are family businesses, and that includes chicken farmers. My general feeling about it is this. Look, I know from Leadership Maryland and my visits there that the problem with recycling chicken waste is that it's very expensive, but I generally have a rule of life about the environment. If you make it, you should be able to reuse it or recycle it, so let's find a way to do that.
Thank you. Tanya has the next question for the next three.
Okay, this question is for Mr. Moore, Gansler, and Lasher. And the question is, do you, jumped on your question. Do you plan to revive the Red Line proposal in Baltimore? And if so, how would you make up for the economic development loss in Baltimore since Governor Hogan killed the Red Line?
Thank you for the question, and the answer is 100% absolutely yes. The killing of the Red Line, and by the way, the returning of close to $1 billion back to the federal government as if that money could not be put to use, was disqualifiable. One of the biggest challenges that we have within our society, particularly when you're looking at the issue of greenhouse gas emissions, is transportation, right, which represents about 38% of what we're looking for in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. We've got to make sure we're prioritizing mass transit, clean mass transit, and that will include things like clean buses. That will include things like reviving the Red Line. That will include issues of making sure we can move people from where they live to where they work. Because the only way that we're going to get to our administration's goal of 100% clean energy by 2035 and completely net zero emissions by 2045 is if we prioritize mass transit and things like the Red Line. So that will be done in the Moore Miller administration.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think it was
Mr. Gansler, yes. Sorry.
Thank you. Yes, and I think what Governor Hogan did to the Red Line was not only symbolic of his view of Baltimore, but it was a sledgehammer to the people in Baltimore City and to mass transit. And so, yes, we would revive the Red Line for sure. There's been things have happened since he killed it. We need to make sure the citizens and the stakeholders in Baltimore are part of that. We also actually have to make sure the Purple Line gets finished. We all know what happened there and how ineffective that was. We need to make sure we have mass transit going from Branch Avenue into Southern Maryland. We need to make sure that we have the metro going over Woodrow Wilson Bridge as it was designed to do. We need to make sure WMATA is fully funded. Mass transit is part of the solution. We need to make sure that Frederick, that we, in the short term, enhance the MARC train service from Frederick into Montgomery County, but we also need to make sure we have light rail from Shady Grove up to Frederick. So there's a lot of projects we need to do, including circulator buses in Baltimore City, because 1/3 of people don't have cars in the city. They need to be able to get to their jobs, and we need to do it with electric buses.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Lasher, yes.
Do we need east-west transit in Baltimore? Yes. Do we need to revive the Red Line as that solution? No. The reason the Red Line was canceled is because it was an expensive boondoggle with its tunnel underneath the harbor. We can use the money better. How so? We need fleets of buses and vans for east-west transit. We can do raised rail, as Las Vegas is exploring. So yes, east-west transit as Baltimore for a priority, but no, not the model of the Red Line with the tunnel underneath the harbor. Waste of money.
Thank you. I've got the next question, and we'll stick with the transportation theme. And we'll ask this of Mr. Barron, Secretary King, and then Ms. Newman. Do you support proceeding with Governor Hogan's plans to widen the Capitol Beltway and Interstate 270? Do you anticipate that the next governor will be able to kill or alter the project? Mr. Barron.
I do support the expansion.
partial expansion of the Beltway and 270. This is a quality of life issue. Nobody likes to be sitting in traffic. I mean, we've all experienced that. I experienced that on the drive over here. It is also a question of economic development. It's hard. We're competing against other jurisdictions like Virginia that do not have as significant traffic problems. What I would do is, consistent with my let's do what works approach, I support the partial expansion of the Beltway from the 270 spur through the American Legion Bridge, as is currently proposed, and the expansion of I-270 south of I-370. That's the partial expansion. Let's see what happens to traffic patterns. Maybe that's enough before we go on to do the full expansion. So I do support the partial expansion. Let's see what happens. Let's see what works, and then determine whether we need to go further. I also support mass transit alternatives. I'm a strong supporter of the Purple Line.
Thanks very much. Secretary King.
The proposed 270 expansion from the governor is a mistake. It will not make traffic better. The toll lanes will make profits for the company that builds them, but it will not translate into better conditions for drivers. There may be alternatives like reversible lanes that the county executive has proposed that could help us to improve the traffic situation. But at the end of the day, we don't need the transportation solutions of 30 years ago. We need to have transportation solutions that respond to the climate challenge. That means we've got to invest much more in public transportation. I agree with colleagues. That's building the Red Line, that's finishing the Purple Line, that's the Southern Maryland Light Rail project, that's more MARC trains. To do all those things, we've got to invest in clean electric buses. We've got to build the charging stations so we can move to electric cars. We've got to have broadband access all over the state so that folks have flexibility in their schedule. Those strategies are much better matched to the current moment as we meet the climate challenge.
Thank you. Ms. Newman.
You know, this is a difficult question because it's a balance of quality of life and economic development. You know, I think about the Jones Falls Expressway. It cut Baltimore City in half and really decimated that part of the community. And as I think about the Capitol Beltway, you know, I've driven that Beltway. It is not easy, and I understand why people want more lanes. My biggest issue with it is we're taxing people to drive those lanes. And that means that if you have more money, you can afford to go faster, and if you have less money, you cannot. That's where I object. I have a real problem with that. And if we want to create equality and opportunity for everyone, let's continue to invest in public transportation. I grew up on public transportation, and if we do a better job of expanding the metro system and make public transportation accessible to all, meaning it goes into the neighborhoods where people are trying to get to work, then I think we will have solved the problem instead of continuing to build additional highways. Doesn't mean we don't need them. They are important, but I don't think we're having a balanced conversation about it.
Thank you. Next question comes from Rona.
Okay, this question is for candidates Gansler, Siegel, and Jane. Sorry. The state does not regulate emissions from air emissions from poultry plants on the Eastern Shore, even though residents there have complained about ill effects from the ammonia and other greenhouse gases. As governor, how would you monitor this air quality issue on the Eastern Shore?
Yes, I mean, very shortly after I became Attorney General, I became enemy number one to the poultry industry. I think that was unfair, by the way, because I do think that this idea of agriculture versus the environment is an unfair one. I think we can do both and should do both. One of the proposals I've been talking about for years is to convert the 2 billion pounds of chicken manure that goes into the bay into a environmentally sound system of getting clean energy, and away from getting that chicken poultry manure into the bay, and therefore we can have actually more poultry, more agriculture, more open space. One of the big things I'm talking about, if you look at my Green Maryland platform, it's the most obviously developed, as you can tell, of any of the candidates on the website. We talk about a moratorium on growth and making sure that we have more agriculture. So yes, in fact, I did go after, my colleagues talked about Reggie. I actually, this is why a Democratic governor matters. When I became Attorney General, Ehrlich would not sign on for our state under Reggie agreement because he was mad at Joe Curran. Right when I became Attorney General with Martin O'Malley, we automatically did that. We went after air
Time's up.
polluters. Thank you.
Thank you.
He didn't hold the sign up. It's all right.
I'm tired.
He's always mean to me.
Mr. Siegel.
Where did CO2 emissions come from? Right? Up until 150 years ago, and actually up until much more recently, there weren't any. What drove them was the enormous expansion of economies, and ours in particular, which contributed 25% of what there is in the world. It was all driven by productivity, but with productivity growth, you have a choice. You can take it in terms of the same amount of labor time you put in and more stuff, or you can take it in terms of less stuff and more time, okay? Now, the dominant model that we had, for 100 years we did both. That is, we reduced the work week, and we stopped doing that in the 1930s. The problem with the economy today and life in the United States is that we have a time famine. And the question is, how do we deal with time, and how do we respond to the climate issues in such a way as to make it possible to expand the amount of time that people have for doing the things that really matter in their life? And
Time's up. Thank you.
Improving air quality, right? Okay. Yeah, I mean, we essentially need to have more regulations, more inspections, making sure that we're protecting the air of residents on the Eastern Shore, we're limiting the use of poultry manure, but then also making sure we have clean drinking water. The issues of Flint, Michigan are close to home. A lot of residents on the Eastern Shore use private drinking wells, which also have unhealthy nitrate levels. All these issues are connected, so making sure we have better regulations, smarter regulations, and making sure that we're not polluting the environment, which also has an impact on our health and also has a racial undertone to it as well, and a geographic undertone.
Thank you. Next question comes from Tanya.
So this question is for Ficker, Moore, and King. And so the question is, we are losing many historical sites on the Eastern Shore, particularly black churches due to climate change. The Maryland Historical Trust has very little funding. How would you support funding the Maryland Historical Trust in support of the churches?
Well, you know, I was appointed to be the first general counsel for the National Caucus on the Black Aged by Rosa Parks, a name that should be familiar to you. And I've always looked out for people who are elderly and who need taking care of. And I would make sure that these black churches on the Eastern Shore are funded to the extent that they need to be to prevent climate change. I think that when we take care of all our citizens, we're really taking care of everyone else who's not in the specific group. So, as the first governor who walked with Martin Luther King in the March on Washington on August 28, 1963, I intend to look out for our African American young people and old people. I can assure you of that, my dear.
Thank you.
Thank you. And the first things we're going to do immediately on day one, in addition to bringing on a person to report directly to me in terms of sustainability, mitigation, and resiliency for the environment, we're also going to make sure that we're fully funding the Environmental Justice Commission. We have people who are already set to do the work but find themselves repeatedly underfunded and repeatedly ignored. And this is a very personal issue for me because, you know, when I ran one of the largest poverty-fighting organizations in this country, you see that these issues are not distinct and are not spread evenly. That they are spread and they are hit specifically, they specifically hit communities of color hardest, and they specifically hit lower-income communities hardest. And so when we're talking about issues of climate change and the fact that when we're talking about everything from rising sea levels and our ability to be able to prioritize seawalls, our ability to prioritize natural barriers that are going to protect environments, we need to make sure we're targeting those resources in a way that we are seeing the impacts, which is distinct and disparate and also hitting communities of color and low-income communities the hardest.
Thank you. Secretary King.
Yeah, you know, the historical treasures of Maryland are deeply personal to me. My great-grandfather was enslaved about 25 miles from where I live in Silver Spring. My great-grandfather was enslaved in Gaithersburg. The cabin he lived in as an enslaved person with his family is still standing on the property. It's important to me that that cabin be preserved. My grandmother graduated from University of Maryland Eastern Shore in 1894. It's important to me that the history of African Americans on the Eastern Shore be preserved. And so, yes, we should absolutely fund the Historical Trust to protect those landmarks. And we have to see this as one reflection of our environmental justice challenges as a state. It always happens that climate change, pollution, the consequences disproportionately fall on low-income communities and communities of color. And so we have to begin with those communities when it comes to environmental protection and when it comes to climate action. The first place to get clean electric buses should be communities that have been hit the hardest by pollution. The first places to get investment around mitigation and resilience should be the communities that have been most impacted by climate harm and pollution in the past.
Thanks, Mr. Secretary. Wow. So we definitely have time for one more question. We may be able to squeeze in a second, and then it's already time for, then it'll be time for closing statements. Where does the time go? So this next question will be for Secretary Perez, Mr. Lasher, and Mr. Siegel. And we've been talking a bit about sort of decarbonizing Maryland in general. This is kind of a specific government question, which is, what efforts will your administration make to decarbonize Maryland's government operations? And will you commit to investing in green or environmentally friendly schools, libraries, other public facilities? And let's leave it at that. Let's start with Secretary Perez.
Absolutely. We have many leverage points as a government. One is procurement. Another is school construction. So as we spend school construction dollars, we need to make sure we are making progress on the climate front. We have state-owned buildings. And if you go to City Center over in Baltimore, where we were trying to improve it, and Governor Hogan did the opposite, that would be a really good example of an opportunity right in the city of Baltimore to address exactly what you're saying, Josh. And so I think we have to use every leverage point. Again, we need to make sure we are, with our procurement, we need to make sure with our spending, we need to make sure with our partnerships. There's so much we can do as a state to make sure we leverage, because old buildings are some of the biggest sources of greenhouse gas emissions. And some of the oldest buildings in this state belong to the state of Maryland. So we need to model behavior.
Thanks very much. Mr. Lasher.
Yes, while I'm uncomfortable with mandates for private developers and private buildings, I am comfortable and would pursue using the state to show the way to the private sector. So for schools, for state offices, for example, State Center needs to be rebuilt in North Baltimore. Yes, let's show the way with building LEEDs compliant offices for state workers and provide other incentives for electrification. So I'm on board with that, Josh.
Thank you. Mr. Siegel.
All right, we've reached a point where I can at least begin to connect what I've been saying to the climate issue. Okay? The last thing I said is that the biggest problem we face in the United States today is a time famine. So if we approach climate change from the point of view of time, right, what is it that we work for? If you look at the household budget, right, transportation turns out to be between 17 and 20% of the budget. You know what transportation was in 1900? Zero. It didn't show up, okay? So now the question is, how do we, in fact, drive the transportation sector of what we work for from, let's say, 20% down to 5%? How do we free up 15% of the work week so that people at the bottom don't have to work 5 days a week or two jobs and can, in fact, go to a 4-day work week, which is what we advocate. And the key to that is reducing the cost of meeting transportation. And that's where the Wuling Mini comes in. Second biggest selling EV in the world. The Tesla is the first. Tesla's $55,000. The Wuling Mini is $5,000. And GM has a 44% stake in it.
Time's
so
up.
what we can have is a near-free EV focused at people on the bottom. So we'll go to electric vehicles and have it led by poor people rather than the wealthy who can buy Teslas.
Time's up. Thank you. Tanya and Rona and I optimistically prepared 11 questions. We had time for 9. We'll do better next time. I blame myself. But anyway, your answers have been really interesting and thought-provoking, and it's now time for 2-minute closing statements, and we are going to start with Mr. Gansler, move our way down this way, then hop back to Mr. Siegel, and I guess end with Secretary King. So 2 minutes, Mr. Gansler.
Thank you. Experience matters. I've been in government for 23 years, and the reason why experience matters is not just because you've actually sat around and done some things like some other in this race, but you understand how the levers of government work. And so, for example, for 7 of the 8 years we were able to pass legislation. One of the pieces of legislation was working with those in this room to get standing for nonprofits to be able to fight and sue during the permitting process and afterward. And that's the kind of thing that matters incredibly much. And so I think Tom said it earlier, what you've done is what you're going to do. And for example, right now, one of the things I'm doing in the private sector is I represent states like Vermont and other states in lawsuits on climate change against the fossil fuel companies. I think it's important. I know the facts, and we're going to be successful there. I really would commend you to our Green Maryland website, things like making sure we put the moratorium on growth. I never thought I'd be quoting Robin Ficker, but he brought up TRAP tonight, and TRAP is a place where they're trying to put 2,600 homes in Lakeside. And so look, I think that the most important thing in this election for the Democratic side is to have someone that has credibility on these issues, both crime and climate, to keep people safe in Maryland, and someone that can win, because only when we win can we work with the Kim Cobles, the Lynn Hellers, the Josh Tolkins, the Mike Tidwells of the world to make this state the leader in our country on climate change and on the environment. And since I have 30 seconds, I'll just talk about the Chesapeake Bay. That's the treasure and jewel of our state. And when I left the Office of the Attorney General, we had made great strides to cleaning up the Bay. What's happened these last 8 years has been abhorrent, and I can't wait to get back to business working with those in this room and those who are watching. And thank you very much for the opportunity tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Lasher.
I think I want to make 2 points in closing. One is that as governor, well, I would start with what I mentioned at the outset, which is my perspective is that on the climate, we should be concerned and take action, but not feel panicked. And this is what I believe that the science says, even when you dig into AR6. And so what does that mean? It means let's not put the pedal down too hard. Let's realize that the difference between this year, that year, 5% here, 5% there, it's not going to make that big a difference for global climate change, which is really going to be driven by what happens in China, India, and the developing world. So let's move forward with decarbonization, clean energy from all sources, not having the state of Maryland, the government picking winners and losers, neutral, as John said. And let's remember one thing, one last thing, which is it's not just about getting a better climate. It's also about something that I was the only candidate here this evening to mention. It's about the power being reliable and affordable for all Marylanders. Right? So we have to balance those different priorities, and that's what I would do as governor. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Moore.
Thank you so much. My sisters and I were raised by a single mom after my dad died in front of me when I was months from my 4th birthday. And we struggled. And I know that after watching the struggles that my mom had, where I first felt handcuffs on my wrist when I was 11, my mom didn't get her first job that gave her benefits until I was 14, that I was going to devote the rest of my life to public service, because I was going to devote the rest of my life for fighting for people like my mom and for fighting for people like my dad. And recently when I was CEO of one of the largest anti-poverty organizations, people say, well, how did climate show itself in that world? The answer was easy, in every way. In the air that people were breathing, in the water that people were drinking, in the schools that people were attending, and the fact that we still have schools where children cannot drink from the water fountains, in the fact that we have people who are living in communities that are not resilient to the very real dangers of climate change. And so in our state, the new motto of the state of Maryland is going to be, leave nobody behind. Because I understand that there are those in the state who do not understand the urgency of the crisis, and there are some who do and understand where we're going to go, but are trying to figure out what it means for them in their life, in their occupation. And I do completely get that. So we are going to make sure that we are going to build a resilient economy that is going to focus on retraining workers, that we're going to make sure we're electrifying the grid, that we're going to make sure that we're going to have a service year option for every single high school graduate, where they have a chance to have a year of service to the state of Maryland, and that will include serving in our environment. That we're going to build an inclusive society where we can have measures of economic growth and save some of the greatest treasures that we have within this state. And so I don't just have the commitment, I have the experience of working across sectors, every sector, in order to get this work done, which is what's going to be required. And I'd appreciate and I ask for your support.
Thank you. Mr. Ficker.
Thank you. I'm Robin Ficker, running for governor, and I'm proud to be here at the University of Maryland, which is the #1 school, head and shoulders above all the other schools in the Big Ten. And as governor, I'm going to help them stay right at the top. I'm the only candidate for governor who wants to cut your taxes. We're going to cut the state sales tax 2 cents, $780 a year per household, to give you a financial stimulus every year and make Maryland become the first state ever to cut its sales tax and give us a national reputation of being business friendly. I was impressed with some of the things that Wes Moore said today, and I'm going to strongly consider him to be a member of my cabinet when I'm governor.
I appreciate the offer.
I've been to Calvert Cliffs. I've walked every inch of it, and I can tell you that each reactor is producing about 860 megawatts of energy. We need to double that production and serve another 1 million homes with Calvert Cliffs in our precious Calvert Cliffs area in Calvert County. We need to double the production there. I'm going to make sure that our sewage treatment plants are not leaking out into the bay so that people have questions about whether or not they should go for a dip. We need to keep our state clean, beautiful. We have wonderful people, Western Maryland, Southern Maryland, Northern Maryland, all parts of the compass. I'm proud to be a lifelong Marylander, and I'm going to do a very good job to represent you as your next governor. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Mr. Ficker. Ms. Newman.
I've seen the very best and the very worst of what Maryland has to offer, and that includes the environment. You know, I bring both public and private sector experience to this opportunity, and you know, I'm really honored to be here today to be able to share a little bit about my background with you. You know, part of my experience in really wanting to understand Maryland is that I got to participate in Leadership Maryland. It was really incredible to travel to every corner of this state. We have beautiful oceans, the incredible bay, and we have Western Maryland in the mountains. We have it all here. What we have to do is take care of it. And I'm actually going to speak not about myself, I'm going to speak about my children. We've all talked about the importance of the bay. We know about wastewater runoff. What we haven't talked about is our disposable economy. We need to start making things that we can reuse, we can recycle, we can repurpose. So I'm going to talk a little bit more globally because my children get very upset when they see us clearing rainforests. I'm going beyond Maryland. I'm going to the whole world and saying we have to do a better job for the next generation. They are counting on us. They expect us to do it. They are going to demand that we do it. And I do understand the balance with economy. I have worked in economic development. I have been a business person. We can do both. we can do a better job for our environment, we can do a great job for our community, and at the end of the day, we need to make it about fairness. Because until there's an opportunity for everyone, and we are talking about fairness in the conversation, whether it's access to the environment or figuring out how we balance economy with reuse, reduce, recycle, and only making things that we can repurpose, then we really haven't served our entire community. Thank you for the time tonight. I appreciate being here.
Thank you so much. Mr. Siegel.
So perhaps it's clear that what I'm talking about is utopian. It's a cultural revolution in the United States. The one thing about climate change and the policy discourse about climate change is that it has enormously lengthened the time span within which we think about public policy and our expectations for people who are potential policy makers. Okay, used to be just a couple of years ahead. Okay, now we're talking, 2040, 2050, end of the century. 2050 is 28 years from now. Okay, do you know how big 28 years is in history? Think about 12 years. You know what 12 years is? The rise and fall of the Third Reich. Hitler comes to power in 33, and he commits suicide in 45. Okay, that's 12 years. Okay, 28 years take you from Roosevelt to Bob Dylan. Okay, so we have, within the time frame that we're seriously thinking about climate change, we've got an alternative. We can, just think in terms of dealing with climate and come out of it successful. It'll be basically life as it is now, except that we won't be worried about any further climate change. Or we could have a transformed culture. We're in the same time frame. Now, if you approach climate change in the right way, we can do it, okay? And that's why time and dealing with things like the amount of labor time that it takes to meet your transportation needs is so central, okay? Because we can knock, for instance, and especially for people at the bottom of the income ladder, because people at the top, actually, if you have a time liberty law that allows you to tell your boss that I'm going half-time or I'm going to a 4-day work week, and you can't be penalized for it, you can cut back if you have too much stuff. If you don't have enough stuff, it's an empty liberty. So the question is, how can you make people at the bottom such that they can meet their needs, in fact, on a 4-day work week? Okay? You can do that if you can knock transportation down from 17% to 6%, and if you can knock housing and shelter down from 30% to 20% or 15%. That's our agenda. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Siegel. Mr. Jain.
Yeah, thank you again so much for this opportunity. Once again, my name is Ashwani Jain, and I am running for governor to make our politics inclusive and accessible. And that does touch on climate change, climate justice, because when I talk to residents, when I talk to organizers, the thing that I always hear is these politicians are not accessible, they're not accountable, and they're not transparent. It's hard to get a hold of them during the campaign. It's even harder to hold them accountable after the election. So that's why, unlike any other candidate, we're fully accessible on my campaign because 100% of our events are free. We don't charge residents and activists to meet me and have a one-on-one. And through my mobile offices, I am personally in a different county each and every day of the week. I am fully accountable because 100% of my campaign is run by residents and activists from every age, background, and county. In other words, you already have a seat at the table from day one of my operation. I'm also 100% transparent because we've shared the most detailed and comprehensive and fully paid for policy agenda on our website, janeforgovernor.com, since last January 2021. And we have proven that we can build a winning campaign with the most residents, the most volunteers from each of our 23 counties in Baltimore City without needing to constantly fundraise. So as activists in this climate change issue, you can make sure that you can hold me accountable and have a seat at the table once I'm elected because I'm giving it to you from day one over a year ago. So I thank you for this opportunity. If there are other questions that people have or want to have a one-on-one with me, you can go to the website, janeforgovernor.com. I'm happy to make the time and elaborate on other questions or answer additional questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Secretary Perez.
We're punching below our weight on climate change. We're punching below our weight on education. We're punching below our weight on healthcare. We're punching below our weight on jobs. We're punching below our weight on affordable housing. We're punching below our weight on racial equity in this state of Maryland. We've got a global pandemic. We've got a war going on. There's a lot of stuff happening. And folks, I come to you with unrelenting optimism because on the darkest nights, we see the brightest lights. I had the privilege of serving as your labor secretary under Barack Obama and the privilege of leading the Civil Rights Division in the first term of Obama. The laws we enforced in the Civil Rights Division were a product of the 1960s, the Civil Rights Movement. The laws we enforced at the Labor Department were a product of the New Deal. Think about those 2 decades. Decades of struggle, war, famine, courage, and ultimately accomplishment. Folks, I come to you with optimism because we are in a moment in time where we can write a new social compact for the 21st century. And I come to you with unrelenting optimism because there are a group of serial activists in this room. I'm looking at one right now. I'm looking at one right now. A group of serial activists that are demanding this. And it is going to take, on all of these issues, someone who has been there on all of these issues. I have served on the Kaiser Commission on Medicaid and the uninsured, and I already have a plan to make sure everyone has health care. I have served in local government. My first vote on the county council was for the Purple Line and against the Intercounty Connector. I have the experience that you need to implode those stovepipes. And my life's work, and I invite you to look at all 35 of my years of life's work, has been about jobs, justice, and opportunity. That's what the moment's about. Let's seize it together.
Thanks very much. Mr. Barron.
I am the only candidate that has proposed an ambitious, systematic, regional effort that would have a major impact on climate emissions. The regional effort we are currently in, RGGI, with 10 other states, a cap-and-trade approach that applies to power plants, has been extraordinarily successful, as I described. It has reduced carbon emissions by 50% for power plants over the past 10 years. It is a regional approach. It's not just Maryland. We're one medium-sized state, but we're partnered with some much larger states. It is a bipartisan approach. It was initiated by Governor George Pataki in New York, who is a Republican. It has industry buy-in. This is a very successful approach. We should apply it, and I would lead on this, apply it to other sectors of the economy. I would immediately, as governor, join the Transportation and Climate Initiative to bring the same cap-and-trade approach to transportation, and then apply it to other areas. Also, I would lead as governor in bringing other states into this regional initiative so that, again, it's not just Maryland, it's some big states like New York and Pennsylvania and others that are joining with us. We could have a huge impact. In that way, I would be the climate czar of my administration. Let me return right now to the social problems that I mentioned in the beginning of my remarks. I want to pioneer a new governing approach in our state, one where we are not just rolling out the next new plan in education and poverty and so on and hoping that's going to work. We have done that. That's what we've been doing for decades. 20 years from now, will our children look back at this time and say that we faced all these problems, stagnant wages, stagnant poverty, stagnant education, and we just kept doing the same thing again and again? Or will they say that at this moment, Maryland did something extraordinary? We rewrote the playbook, pioneering a new governing approach based on evidence about what actually works in all of these areas, and that we finally moved the damn needle on education and stagnant wages and health care and other problems. That's the future I want from Maryland.
Thank you.
Let's do what works.
Thank you, Mr. Barron. Secretary King.
Not enough. You did not hear enough from my colleagues about what we need to do to take on the climate emergency that we face. One of the most haunting conversations we have in the K-12 Climate Action Commission that I chair is with a school board member from Santa Barbara, California, who ran on a climate platform. Nobody would pay attention to her. And then when she was on the board, she would say, well, why aren't we getting electric buses? Why aren't we putting solar panels on the school? No one would pay attention. And then there were droughts. And then there were mudslides. And then there was loss of life. And then the community mobilized around climate action. We do not want to look back at this moment and regret that we didn't lead with ambition. And so I have to say, Wes has a plan that sets the goal at 2045. Too little, too late. Not enough specifics, not enough measurable metrics for how we are going to make progress to net zero. When Tom was DNC chair, there was an opportunity to keep language in the Democratic Party platform that would commit to ending subsidies for fossil fuels. He didn't do that. And his plan includes clean natural gas, which is not a thing. Natural gas is not clean. It's not how we get to net zero. The reality is, this is a crisis, an emergency that requires bold action. And some people may say, well, the plan that we lay out at johnkingforgovernor.com, the plan around getting to net zero by 2035 is so ambitious. It's a long shot. Well, my life is a long shot. My mom passed away when I was 8. My dad when I was 12. In the period when it was just my dad and me, my dad was struggling with Alzheimer's. In high school, I struggled. I got kicked out of high school. The first U.S. Secretary of Education had been kicked out of high school. But the miracle was that teachers and public schools saved my life. It's a miracle I'm standing here. And so I believe in long shots. We can get to net zero by 2035, but we have to lead with specifics. And that's where I hope this conversation will go as this campaign moves forward. Who will deliver on the action necessary to truly tackle climate and environmental justice?
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, amazing. Great job, everybody. Let's give a big hand for these candidates. We're truly honored to have you all here. Thank you. Thanks to our audience, both live and in person and out there in Facebook Live land. And thank you to our sponsors. Just a reminder, we're doing this again tomorrow at Goucher College. Many of these folks will be there, and there'll be one new face. So really, this is a great conversation. We're looking forward to a great conversation tomorrow, and thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, and candidates, I'm sorry, we have a request. If you could, like, group closer so for a picture, that would be most welcome.
This is great.